and welcome to a special Tea Party edition of Instavision. I'm Glenn Reynolds. Well, Professor Elizabeth Price Foley is the professor of law at Florida International University, and she's also the author of a new book from Cambridge University Press, The Tea Party, Three Principles. Welcome, Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here, Glenn. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again. So, a professor of constitutional law writes a generally favorable book about the Tea Party, and it's published by perhaps the world's leading academic press. So what's happened? Did the transporter beam get crossed up? Am I in some sort of bizarro bearded Spock parallel universe where up is down, left is right, forward is backward, and bearded Spock is right there, actually. How about that? Or at least I have sleeves on my outfit, so you got to give me that. What gives?
Well, don't get too excited about it. I'm still clearly in the minority amongst constitutional law professors, and I think I just serendipitously got an editor of a major university press who was not necessarily left of center politically. So I think all the stars lined up. Well,
that's news in itself. That almost is a bearded Spock moment, isn't it? But what are the three principles of the Tea Party movement?
Yeah, I really wanted to write a book about what the substance of the Tea Party was all about, because there's been a lot of Tea Party books, but I've read them all, and, none of them want to talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is what really makes this movement tick. And as a constitutional law professor, it was clear to me that what made them tick were three very old and important constitutional principles. So the first one is limited government. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. It manifests itself in their opposition to bailouts and the health care reform law. The second one is what I call an unapologetic defense of U.S. sovereignty, which manifests itself in things like their position on illegal immigration and the war on terror. And then the third one is constitutional originalism, which means that the Tea Partiers think the Constitution should be interpreted according to its original meaning, and they reject this living constitutionalism stuff.
Yeah, the living constitutionalism stuff is sort of funny to me because it seems there's sort of a double standard there anyway. I interviewed Richard Posner a while back when he had his book out on terrorism, and he was saying, my views on how we ought to constitutionally treat the war on terror are just an example of a living constitution that changes and adapts to changing circumstances. And yet, strangely enough, I'm not being received very favorably by the usual living constitutionalism fans. So it seems like it's kind of a one-sided thing anyway. But describe what you mean by the difference between living constitutionalism and originalism.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, rhetorically, the living constitutionalists have sort of won the spin war because, who wants a dead constitution, right? So, it has this sort of rhetorical appeal, but if you peel back all the layers, what you see is that living constitutionalism means that, we don't have a written constitution. George Will said that a constitution is supposed to be an anti-evolutionary device. It is supposed to put our basic structure of government and rights beyond transient majorities. And a living constitutionalism approach allows, 9 unelected for life Supreme Court justices to simply reinterpret the Constitution according to their own subjective preferences.
Well, in fact, you say in the book that the living constitutionalism approach is favored by elites because it gives power to the elites instead of constraining the elites.
That's right. I mean, think about how disrespectful it is to we the people to allow these federal judges who have lifetime tenure and basically are relatively insulated politically, to give them all this power to change our Constitution without a formal amendment via Article 5 processes. The founders, Thomas Jefferson was probably the one founder who was the most ardent living constitutionalist of his generation. But his brand of living constitutionalism was completely different than today's progressive living constitutionalism, because his idea was, every 20 years or so, we the people should gather in a constitutional convention and rewrite the Constitution. And by allowing unelected judges to just reinterpret the Constitution, we the people kind of get cut out of the picture.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting because you actually see sentiment along those lines from both the left and the right now. I was at this conference at Harvard Law School back in the fall talking about constitutional conventions where you saw very similar arguments actually being made by people from opposite ends of the political spectrum. But speaking of that, what would you see as the big difference between the Tea Party movement and something that seems to have inspired a lot more academic attention, which is the Occupy movement?
Yeah, I mean, they're about as polar opposite as you can get. And the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement do both seem to be angry at the same things. I mean, they're angry at America going downhill. They're angry at the bailouts and the debt. But they come at it in such completely different ways. I mean, the Occupy Wall Street movement certainly couldn't be characterized as any sort of constitutional movement. In fact, the things that they espouse completely cut against the grain of our original understandings of the Constitution, whereas the Tea Party movement really is sort of an old school constitutional movement, which is, I think, seeking to restore the original meaning of the Constitution. And from my perspective, that can't be a bad thing.
I think that's actually very correct. Well, one thing you talk about in the book is sort of the Tea Party's character as a leaderless movement, which I guess is something it does share with the Occupy movement. I have heard some pundits say that the Tea Party movement has failed because it didn't produce its own presidential candidate to run. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the people who make those comments just fundamentally misunderstand the Tea Party. As I say in the book, this is a movement. It's not a political party. So their whole task, I think, is to try to infiltrate the Republican Party, and I think they've done that pretty successfully. I really think the Tea Party is the new Republican base. So they're not looking to anoint some central Tea Party leader. And if you look at the exit polling from the Republican presidential primaries, what you see is that the Tea Partiers are kind of evenly splitting their support amongst the major candidates. That's to be expected because all of these candidates have been moved in the Tea Party direction. All of them, to a greater or lesser extent, are espousing these three principles I identify in the book.
Well, it's very interesting to me, and I have to say, my feeling is that the Tea Party influence in this election is going to be felt more in the Senate and House races, and for that matter, in a lot of state and local races, than directly in the presidential race, because I think that's where, from my observation, that's where most of the activists are focusing most of their energy, actually.
Yeah, and they've become a much more mature movement. People wonder why they're not protesting in the street right next to Occupy Wall Street. And it's because I think they've been there, done that. That was the first phase. They had to vent their anger initially. But once they had such incredible success in the midterm elections in 2010, I think they matured very quickly and realized that, they need to get down to brass tacks and start really working to turn over the Senate in particular and also have a major influence on the local elections. But I will say this, come November in our general presidential election, no matter who the Republican nominee is, I think the Tea Party is going to show up in full force because if nothing else, they just want to cast an anti-Obama vote, much like many people did cast an anti-Bush vote in 2008.
I think that's absolutely right. And I agree. The rallies were very important in the early days because they shattered this illusion the media had put up that Obama was overwhelmingly popular and there were only a few malcontents here and there who didn't like him. So I think they were quite valuable at that stage. But pretty quickly people figured out that you don't really change politics by marching in the streets. You change politics by doing the sort of less picturesque work in the precincts and the counties and so on. And my impression is that's what they're doing. Well, exit question. What's next for you?
That's a great question. I don't know. There's another book on the horizon somewhere, and it'll have something to do with the Constitution. I'm just not quite sure yet.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks for taking the time to join us. This book is a winner, and I encourage everybody to check it out. It's absolutely worth your time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
That was Professor Elizabeth Price Foley of Florida International University, and her book is The Tea Party, 3 Principles from Cambridge University Press. Better stuff than you see out of most academic presses most of the time, that's for sure. Thanks very much, and then we'll be back next week. In the meantime, have fun on the Internet. Thanks.